Lower the temperature or lower the stakes? Let's find out today on Whole Hog Politics. I'm Bill Sammon, joined as usual by my old pal Chris Stirewalt. We both work at the Hill and News Nation, but only you, Chris, are the author of Whole Hog Politics, the superb political newsletter that appears each week in thehill.com. By the way, anyone can receive the newsletter for free by simply scanning the QR code on the screen right now. Hopefully I'm pointing in the right direction. Chris, you probably knew Charlie Kirk more than I did, but we both had the pleasure of meeting and chatting with him from time to time over the years. In the wake of his tragic assassination this week, you argue in Whole Hog Politics that while it's all well and good to call for a lowering of the temperature, the political temperature, it would be better if we could simply lower the political stakes. You actually wrote it this way, quote, "When we are told that the next election could be the last election, or that our democracy won't survive a victory by the party of these 65 million Americans or these 65 million Americans, we open the door to destructive violence." Elaborate on that a little.
Well, look, I'm a word guy, and I love etymology, and the word bromide for empty rhetoric. It comes from bromine, the chemical, and in the 19th century, have you ever heard of bromo seltzer?
That was the thing when I was a kid.
Okay. So bromo seltzer stopped including bromine salts because they figured out that bromine salts were very bad, were toxic for people in large quantities. But bromine salts are a kind of sedative, right? So if you administer bromine salts to people, it will calm them down, but it will ultimately be toxic for them. And I think when we say things like we should lower the temperature, it's fine, right? It's okay. You're cooling the moment. You're calling people sort of like we need civility. I'm obviously.
What could be wrong with that,
I hope obviously.
Right?
Yeah, I hope obviously people would say that I'm pro civility, pro decency, and human charity. But when we talk about the system, right? When we talk about what's going on, we need solutions, right? We need to talk about why. Look, you can go back to Timothy McVeigh in 1993, but certainly the 21st century in the post 9/11 era has been an era with lots more political violence than in the generation that preceded it, right? So we had a lull, essentially. We had an extraordinary amount of political violence, starting with the Kennedy assassination and culminating with the days of rage around Martin Luther King's assassination.
Well, let me stop you there and let me interject this.
Go ahead.
Because put it in an even larger context. In other words, we tend to think in the short term, like, oh my gosh, we're seeing all of this political violence. We've never had it so bad. But is it true that over the course of American history, a couple of centuries plus, it's more the norm or not? In other words, do we have political violence throughout our history and then we have periods of relative calm, and then when we do have a return to political violence, it seems like the world has gone crazy again?
America has had less political violence than most of world history. But yes, in the period of time before the Civil War, and I'm not saying we're in a period of time before Civil War, despite the best efforts of many people in public life today. John Brown, well, how about this? The reason you're familiar with Bleeding Kansas and the massacres that took place in Kansas in the run-up to the Civil War. And the reason they did these things, John Brown, old Potawatomi Brown, and the massacre that he and his sons undertook, and the savage violence undertaken by pro-slavery forces in places across Kansas. That was all around an election, right? The motivating part of the violence in Bleeding Kansas was around an election, because the reliably terrible Stephen Douglas had come up with a plan for what to do about slavery, and they called it popular sovereignty. And they said, we'll just when new territories come into the country, we're going to pitch the Compromise of 1850, which drew a line, but said when new territories come into the country as states, we'll let the people decide. We'll let the voters decide what's going to happen. And the things that John Brown did and the things that the pro-slavery forces did were evil, but they were rational, right? They were not, when we read the stories of some murderers and you realize we could think of Gabby Gifford's killer. People said, well, it's from the right. And then you read and you're like, oh, you're just sick. You're just a very sick person. The slaughter that went on in Kansas was rational slaughter, because it was arranged around the idea of winning Kansas as a slave state or as a free state. And John Brown may have been a madman in the eyes of many, but what he was doing was rational. And my point about elections is you have to lower the stakes of elections so that political violence is not a rational choice. It's always evil, but it should also be irrational. And the way that you make political violence an irrational choice is that you have a system that functions as the framers designed it, as it is intended to function, which is that the Congress resolves the difficulties that people in the country, that the massive disputes, the major conflicts are resolved in a Congress that works.
You know, it's funny. We talked a week or two ago about the upcoming midterm elections, and I was making the point, I think I even said, everything hinges on the midterm elections. And I talked about how, what I meant was, really in the context of whether the current president will be able to continue to enact his legislative agenda. All of that hinges, which is kind of a big deal, but it's not everything under the sun.
Yeah.
But that hinges on the midterm elections. But I thought it was so interesting in your column this week, you kind of, for the sake of making a larger point, you kind of took the opposite tack, and you said the following: if the fate of the nation hinges on the outcome of the next election, then the nation is already lost. If which of the two parties, which by the way agree on about 80% of things, controls Congress is the question on which the future of the republic hangs, then the republic has no future. So when you say lower the stakes, you're saying we've got to get away from this idea, perpetuated by both sides, that every election is an existential threat. Every election, your freedoms will be taken away. America will cease to exist, and it really has come from both sides. And by the way, there's a lot of incentives to perpetuate that on the part of politicians and the media and everything else, because people become very vested in it. And of course they have to get involved now because, boy, I don't want to lose my freedoms. I don't want to lose the country. But you say that in the larger arc of history of the country, it's a zigzagging course. And I used to put it this way, and I'm a little older than you, and maybe this is probably one of the few realizations I had before you did because of my age. But that is, I would say to people when they come to me and say, my God, this latest thing is happening, the country has gone crazy, I would say, it's a resilient republic. It seems crazy in the moment, but the country will move on, and we'll have a different president, and we'll have different things, and we'll get to a better place, hopefully, right?
There are many pernicious lies told in service of people obtaining political power. A very damaging one, of course, is that the reason we lost the election is because we weren't as bad as the other people. So in order to win the next election, we have to be worse. And we've talked before about the dangers of mirroring, right? And we talked about that in the context of the Democrats embracing full MAGA style, Trump style trolling in the person of Gavin Newsom, but just generally, and about how mirroring is a ratchet that drives discourse downward. But the other one, that's another one that's really, really pernicious, really, really dangerous, is the idea that total victory is possible. That once we have the power that we seek, then, and this is a point that Peggy Noonan made years ago that really stuck with me I think it was after the 2008 election, but at whatever point, she said, 47% of the country, you won a big victory, Barack Obama, but 47% of the country still didn't vote for you. Even in the biggest win for any candidate since the 1990s, almost half the country still voted against you. The idea of a republic is there is no permanent victory. Every step is iterative. In navigation, the term, by the way, have you ever seen The Spirit of St. Louis, the great Jimmy Stewart film about
absolutely.
Charles Lindbergh? So dead reckoning is you set off on a course. Old Lindy started flying in this direction, and he was keeping time about where he should be by this point. And then when the time elapsed, then he said, okay, now I need to go in this direction. Dead reckoning means you set off on a course for a while, and then you take a new sounding and you say, okay, now where do we go from here? And it's usually not in a straight line. Sometimes it is. And we call those mandates. We call those when we think about 1984 or 1972 or 1936 or whatever, you have these moments where the people say, no, keep doing exactly what you're doing. But usually what we get is, and all we have in a republic is it's binary code. It's ones and zeros. It's red or blue. And so when you have the red going, you say, okay, a little blue, tap, tap, tap. We're gonna try to trim the sails in that direction to obtain a different and better outcome. I understand that is two things I understand. One is I understand why that is an unsatisfying process for people who fantasize that one day total victory could be had. I get why it's frustrating. But also, I will say that only works if the system is working. The only way that dead reckoning navigation for a republic works is if you're actually reckoning. And what we do now is that we have a Congress that will not be Congress. We have a Congress that there is no excuse for political violence. Political violence is wholly unacceptable. But we should have a system in which it is not only unacceptable, but irrational, right? That is irrational. The people who attacked the Capitol on January 6, 2021, thought they were doing the right and patriotic thing. They thought that they were the good guys. Luigi Mangione thinks he's a good guy. He thinks he's doing the right thing because the system is too broken and da-da-da. They're wrong, right? Ashley Babbitt and Luigi Mangione are both wrong. They're coming from different directions, but they're saying the same thing, which is the system is too broken for us to work within it anymore. Violence is the answer. We'll have to do the wrong things in order to do the right thing. And I hope that any member of Congress that can hear this, or as they think about how this works, we need a Congress that can resolve the disputes that arise in a republic. And if they will not do their job, which includes always compromise, working with the other side to effectively produce legislation and govern, if they cannot do that, we are only at the beginning of a long, miserable period of political violence.
Chris, the two central rules of journalism are take it out of context and blow it out of proportion. So with that in mind, I want to read one last excerpt from your excellent column, and I preface it that way so that you don't get too mad at what I'm about to read. That you wrote
Here we
today,
go.
quote, "It doesn't matter that much which party wins the midterm elections next year. I don't care very much at all which party wins the elections I cover," end quote. Now, I'm taking that out of context, and I think the broader point you're making is, of course you care about these things, but in the larger scheme of the arc of American history, it doesn't matter as much. And it goes to your point about lowering the stakes of this talk that everything is our hair on fire. We got to go crazy because the next election could be the last one.
I love that there are tens of thousands of people who want to watch you and me, old friends,
Who are
my
they?
mentor.
Thank God for you.
They're probably almost as weird as us. I love that they're out there and that they want to be here for us. And maybe they're just coming for discussions of classic rock and roll. I don't know. But we could have more. There could be more. We'd have to forego the people probably who like this content, but we could have more, right? We could be salacious. We could be mean. We could be ugly. We could ramp up the stakes. We could say, this is it. The Virginia gubernatorial election means everything for the future of the country. And if this side or that side doesn't win, it's all over for America. And you better be terrified to not watch what we're saying because everything is about this. Or you can say, I wrote a book about this. There was a guy, and I know I should stop talking, but the story matters a great deal to me. There's a guy who's one of the founders of the big private equity firm KKR, Jerry Coburg. And when he quit his job and shocked the investors, I think it was about 1987, he said he didn't like the direction things were going. They were making more and more money, but he didn't like what was becoming of their company.
I remember that.
And
He went all Jerry Maguire, right?
Yes, he did. And he gave this speech, and he said that a virtue or an ethic without sacrifice is not an ethic. And if you're not willing to forego something, then you don't really believe in the things that you say. So if you say lower the temperature, this is epistemological closure. If you believe this, then that means that what's next, that has implications, right? If you know something, don't just believe it, but you know it, then that has consequences. And for us, it has consequences that we know that there are certain things that are forbidden to us to do as journalists, as Americans, as dads and husbands and Christians. And there's a lot of stuff that is forbidden for us to do to make a buck because of the things that we know to be true. And for politicians, figuring out which ends or which means can be justified by which ends. If you say that you want to lower the temperature, and if you say that things have to come down, that has implications, right? If you really know that's true, then that has implications. And among those implications is to stop demonizing other people and pretending that if you don't win this election and you don't get what you want, that the republic will fall. Because the irony, of course, is if we don't, then it will fall. As Abraham Lincoln said, America will either endure for all time as a nation of free men or die by suicide. And that's it,
it's
folks.
almost like with this guy that gave the speech, he made the key point that it has to entail a sacrifice. The virtue has to come with a cost. And when you say lower the temperature, there's not a lot of cost to that. But when you say lower the stakes and you explain to people whether I'm elected or not isn't really going to change the future of the republic, that's a cost. That's being honest with people.
That's a cost.
You're getting people less amped up to turn out at the polls or to send you money for your contributions or whatever. So that's the difference, right, between lower the temperature, which again is all well and good, and lower the stakes.
You can play the supercut of every bad thing that Democrats said demonizing Republicans in the past 10 years. You can play the supercut of everything Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans have said demonizing Democrats in the past 10 years. And you could keep score, and you could say, well, actually, I think the frequency of this and da 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 da. Get feel free, but there's not a dime's worth of difference between these parties when you get right down to it in terms of being decent and protecting the idea that we are Americans first and partisans second. The Democrats are going to point to things that Donald Trump has said, and the MAGA people are going to point to things that they've said, and you could do that all day long. But we know in our hearts that the system is not working because, in substantial part, because of the demonization, the rotten, wretched demonization, and the raised stakes that we are subjecting voters to. And we are incubating generation after generation of new voters in a space where the choices in elections are not. I'll shut up by just saying, you covered the 2000 election. You had a front row seat for the 2000 election. I was a kid. I was a dork. I was a young, very young reporter, just recently out of school in the 2000 election. But I remember what the complaint about the 2000 election was from so many voters. These two candidates are the same. Al Gore and George W. Bush. They're both these boring sort of like, what's the difference here? Why don't we have a real choice? You think about that versus what we are told now, which is either me or the apocalypse. Either me. Yeah. Right. Now it's good and evil, not who's going to put the money in a Social Security lockbox.
Chris, there's a lot of talk. And by the way, we should point out that as we're talking, there's word that, the president himself is saying that the suspect is now in custody. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But there's been a lot of talk in the days since this tragic assassination about, that some sort of line has been crossed, that it's some sort of an inflection point. And I know we're still in the heat of the moment, and tempers are and emotions are high, and rightfully so, and understandably so, I should say. But is it too early for you to gauge whether there is some sort of long-term impact on our politics, on our election? I mean, this guy devoted his life to, and was quite effective at influencing our politics and our policy. Does his death, as tragic as it was, does it have an impact going forward?
Look, when leaders of political movements are killed, and we should point out Charlie Kirk is the most effective organizer. He's being discussed in a lot of his legacy, whether you like or dislike his legacy, is being discussed in many ways. His robust and increasing expressions of his faith as a component, his clickbaity, very online kind of content is being discussed, but also his use and embrace of free speech. All of this is being discussed. I think of Charlie Kirk, when I think of Charlie Kirk and his career, I think of a person who was an extraordinarily successful political organizer, right? He did what Republicans had been trying to do forever, which is find a way to get young voters to engage. And if you look at the arc of what happened with young men in America, 2012 to 2024, look at the numbers for young men, for men under 30 in America. Look at those numbers. Democrats did a lot to make that happen, no question. But if you're looking for one person who did that, it would be Charlie Kirk. After the leaders of political action groups die or are killed or whatever, sometimes it intensifies, goes forward. Sometimes it does not. I have no idea what will happen going forward, but I'm sure there will be, sadly, a struggle over who is the person who is the outreach for young people, right? Donald Trump Jr. or is it whoever? And division, I'm sure, inside any political, the reason people are in politics typically because they're ambitious, and so I'm sure there will be division there. But I have no idea
The
how
last
that will
thing
all play out.
on Charlie Kirk before we move on to a couple other topics is just simply, and you touched on it, you talked about how he was almost singularly impactful. I think I heard you say something earlier in the week on one of your television appearances that his influence almost rivaled that of his political party, the RNC.
Oh, way more.
So it's more. You and I have talked about how the both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, have declined in impact in recent years for a variety of reasons. But you're saying that this guy and his turning point movement had sort of eclipsed the raw political organizing power of one of the two major political parties in the country.
Well, I mean, but we have these perniciously, one of the reasons we have so much partisanship in America is that we have these very weak parties, which are supposed to act as mediating institutions. And I will not go on at length about how bad McCain-Feingold was. And then when it was amplified by the citizens, the rightly decided but very consequential Citizens United decision that the parties are husks of what they were before. And I think that's been part of why we have so much more partisanship. What Charlie Kirk did was build an organization predicated on connecting with, identifying young conservatives on campus, making them feel like warriors, right? That they're in a fight against the dominant culture. And the university system, I am sure you remember this feeling when you were in school, that at Miami of Ohio, that the professors were left, right? That it was left, the conventional wisdom on campus was left among the faculty. And there was, I'm sure, for Republicans on that campus, a thrill, a frisson of excitement that came from, you know what, I'm doing my own thing, and you can go to hell. We're loud, we're proud. As campus culture got more and more radical, and as the institutions moved further and further left, the satisfaction, the thwack of that rebellion to the right became more and more powerful. Charlie Kirk tapped into that and raised up, and this is where Democrats have to, they have to, and there's been a lot of acknowledgement of this among Democrats, they have to tip their hats to Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk, because what they did was what Democrats used to be able to do, which is find disaffected young people, engage with those disaffected young people, and indoctrinate, right? Because if you can get them when they're young, if you can get somebody to form a political ideation when they're in college, there's a very good chance that they're going to stay with it for quite a while. And Democrats always banked on the fact that they had the young people, certainly the young women, but at least half or most of young men, and that it was attrition over time. What Charlie Kirk and Turning Point were such a big part of was not just tapping into that for clicks. A lot of people tapped into that for clicks, but Charlie Kirk actually built an organization that funneled those voters young people into adulthood and into being part of the electorate. And you saw it very clearly in 2024.
I was actually surprised that it took that many years for that trend to develop. In other words, you know, college kids, if you go back to the 60s, you know, the original, the kids that were rebelling against and sticking it to the man and all that, they were rebelling.
I say this with love, but baby
yeah,
boomers.
Right. They were rebelling against, I think probably in a lot of ways, I think their professors were probably less leftist in those days. And then as a lot of those boomers grew up and became college professors, some of them did, and it became, that was sort of the establishment. The left was sort of the establishment, especially on college campuses. So it wasn't rebellious at all to be a student who was a leftist. And I always thought, if you were really sticking it to the man, if you were really going to be edgy here, wouldn't you be a Republican? But it sort of finally has gotten to that point, right?
And now we're seeing the long march. So the the campus culture of the 1960s and early 1970s was a reaction to external events, but also from a to a university system that was conservative in the small C sense. These were people who were pre-war people or
Focused
World
on
War
Western
II.
civilization as the curriculum.
Focused on Western civilization and just uptight. Animal House is a great movie, right? Dean Farber is not the hero of Animal House. And that's a movie made by baby boomers about what their experience in college was like. And we're rowdy and we don't care and we're libertine and we're living out loud. And so those young people grew up and then they became the establishment, right? They became the establishment. And then you have a counter reaction. And so now we're living in the counter reaction to that. And we're watching the same external forces, this time in the form. So previously it had been Democratic administrations cramming change down on conservative, small c conservative higher education institutions. Now it's a MAGA administration forcing that change down on. So this is this is how we end up navigating in a zigzag pattern. We go this way, and then the pressure is pushed that way, and then that way, and then that way, and then that way. So I guess we can say that 30 years from now, we'll be talking about campus crazies on the left instead of on the right. And they will be attacking a administration and hierarchy that was born out of this moment.
Let's talk Kamala Harris. This week we saw an excerpt from her book. It raised a lot of eyebrows because she seemed to be settling scores, saying that it had been reckless for Joe Biden to go forward with a re-election bid, that it was about ego and ambition. She wasn't kind to her staff. Or the staff at the White House, and then, predictably, the Biden team has now fired back and said, it's basically become a kind of an ugly set of recriminations here. What political impact does that have, if any, for the Democratic Party as we head into the next couple of elections? Is it, first of all, does it make it less or more likely that Kamala Harris is even a potential presidential candidate? And secondly, does it have any impact? Does this cause heartburn for the Democratic Party writ large?
I haven't seen any on the record attributed quotes in response from the Biden people. I've only seen a blind quote.
There was a bunch of blind. I haven't seen any on the record, but there was a bunch of blind ones that came out this morning.
And I read one in Axios, and it was basically like, yeah, and she didn't even do anything in the administration. Okay, like she wasn't even doing anything major. It's like, I think that's what she said. I think that's what she said. I don't think that Kamala Harris is some kind of generational political talent. And I think that the Obama people who inflated her balloon so wildly in 2020 did her a disservice. The expectations were way too high. And all of that. So I should say she's she's a massive talent of unbearable weight. However, I will say, good for her, right? Good for her. The Biden, as the reputation of the people around Joe Biden heads for the septic, like as it is just hurtling. It has to go through the mantle of the earth to get lower. Right. And we should remember, we're only at the beginning of the recriminations that will take place inside the Democratic Party about the people who Kamala Harris, the Republicans are beefing with Kamala Harris, and they say, well, well, that wasn't me. They say, you should have told us, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, okay. In a shocking move, a politician acted in their own perceived self-interest. A Republican would never do that. I'm shocked to see it after the selfless leadership I have seen from so many Republicans. But Kamala Harris saying a true thing out loud, which is that it was totally reckless. It was
Yeah.
obviously reckless
Right.
for Joe Biden to run for reelection. It was bad for the country. It was bad for his party. It was bad. And it was, and I said it at the time when he did it, it was a shocking, solipsistic act to say, I don't believe in my party enough. I don't believe in my country enough. There's a guy who could have lowered the stakes. There would have been a good opportunity for stake lowering and say, we'll just let the process work, and then somebody's going to get elected and somebody will lose, and it'll be fine, and we'll still have the Constitution, and we'll still love our neighbors as ourselves. Not that dude. And I think it will be very helpful for Kamala Harris with Democrats to start the process of saying, let me tell you something. This was a joke. And I think it will probably, her stock will probably go up because there are no, as I have said to you many, many times, there are no Biden Democrats. There are zero Biden Democrats in the world.
I agree with that, although I will say that I don't think she will run for president. Chris, before we go, I want to remind our viewers that you, of course, are the host of The Hill Sunday, which is an excellent Sunday morning chat show on News Nation. And I just was wondering if there was anything that you wanted to talk about for in terms of this coming weekend's show that you're planning as we speak.
Every week I disappoint our paymasters because I never remember who the big name lawmaker guests that we have are, and I'm sitting here desperately racking my brain for the names. But
what about the scratch pad of destiny? Did you write it down somewhere on your scratch pad of destiny?
I didn't write it down. I threw away right before we started. I threw away my old scratch pad. So, but I do know this because the one that I remember because I'm really excited about is next week we have Constitution Day next week, and throughout the coming year, or the coming 10 months or 12 months or whatever, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the founding, we're doing these little USA 250 segments. And I'm going to talk with Yuval Levin, who is my other boss at the American Enterprise Institute, and he has a fantastic book about the Constitution, and it's called American Covenant. And I'm going to talk with him about he wrote it obviously before the political violence was the theme of the national discussion entirely, but about how the Constitution can save us, right? That if we turn to it, and the utility of the Constitution at this time. So it will be a timely and poignant civics lesson, I believe.
Marking our, what is it, semi-quincentennial? Is that like?
I don't like their naming of this. I don't.
It's harder to say than I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial, but that was easy to say. But semi-quincentennial is a little trickier.
And at the 150, it was the semi-sesquicentennial.
I don't remember that.
And I think they should have gone with bi-semi-sesquicentennial because they called it at USA 150 in 1926. They called it, and I think this is cool, they called it the semi.
Nice. Just shorten it that way. That is
Semi's
very cool. Folks, that's all the time we have this week. My name is Bill Sammon. I'm joined by my old pal Chris Stirewalt. We will see you next week on Whole Hog Politics.